Welcome back to another episode of the One Tree Hill Rewatch here on the Filmaholic channel. Today we're going to be talking about two episodes, 513 and 514, which is the 101th episode of the show and 102. So 513 is Echoes, Silence, Patience, and Grace. It's originally aired April 14th, 2008. So there was a bit of a time jump, not time jump, but like a little bit of a hiatus after the 100th episode before this one. This was directed by Greg Prange, who I've mentioned in the past directs a lot of big episodes. It's really weird, and I would like to know how they make these decisions in terms of One Tree Hill, because I know other shows, they're sometimes randomly assigned episodes to direct, to write. Obviously, Mark writes what he wants to write in this episode, or this show. But I don't know how the directing works, because I don't know why Greg wouldn't have directed the 100th instead of this episode, but that's how it worked out. So the main things about this episode is you have Lucas still with Karen and Andy, although Karen's not in this episode, which seemed like an interesting decision only to bring her back for one episode and to not show her in this one, even though she was supposed to be there. We see Lily for a scene, which is really nice, actually. She talks about Keith, and she had a dream about Keith being with Lucas. That was nice. And he spends the majority of the episode just talking to Andy about Lindsay, wanting to get her back, and how, New York's not that far from there, and that Andy has a private jet, which I don't understand that, because why would Andy's private jet be in Tree Hill? Because they took that boat there. They've been sailing. Anyways, I mean, I know it's like the show, so you got to get past certain things, but to me, it's like, I don't know why. Anyways. Which he ends up taking the plane later in the episode and going to see Lindsay and getting her to agree to edit his book. But that's all it's going to be. She doesn't want to have a relationship with him, although he's still going to think that's going to happen. Which is also interesting, too, because we know the last time that they made a book together, it took about a year for them to edit that book. This episode would have been early 2011, like based. I'm not exactly sure. I can't really bog down the timeline with this season because it's really iffy, because we know 5/15, which we're coming up to, is Jamie's birthday, and that's in June. So you would think this would be in like April or May, but really I think it's earlier in the year. It's supposed to be earlier in the year, and there's just big gaps of time between these episodes. But it's been like at least a month since the 100th episode when we get to this one. But I don't think it's actually, it has to be in February, I believe, this episode, which would put the 100th episode probably being in January. Because it says that Brooke is still 22 in this episode. She's actually being interviewed by the adoption lady, which none of that goes well. But I guess it doesn't go entirely awful, because she does have that speech at the end about her mother, and then ends up getting Angie in the next episode, Foster. But yeah, so in the conversation with the adoption lady, she mentions that she is 22, which she'd be turning 23 in March. Her birthday's in March. They don't care about the timeline. I care about the timeline. But that stuff's going on. Lucas is with Andy. Goes to see Lindsay. But yeah. So if they would have started editing that book and everything, just say February. The book's finished in June, essentially. Or early July. Very quickly. Peyton has most of her scenes in this episode with the character Max, which we were first introduced in season 4, which is played by Mark Schwann. Was a record store guy. Really, all of these scenes with him is just for her to be able to vent and say how she's feeling to someone, to the audience. But we need a character there that she is speaking to, because she's obviously not doing her podcast and stuff like that anymore. She also thinks about selling her car in this episode because it caused problems, and the whole comment thing in the book. She doesn't sell it, thankfully. She ends up keeping it. And we also have this stuff with Dan in this episode, and his pro officer, who he pays to listen to him talk about Jamie and whatnot. And then the guy ends up not taking the money, but Dan tells him to donate it to charity. And that's the only time we ever see that parole officer. But we have those moments. Dan also comes by the school and sees Jamie. I love Jamie and Dan scenes, partly, I guess, because it reminds me of me and my grandfather's relationship. So it was nice seeing them together, and how, I guess, much Dan cares about Jamie. But that's the majority of it. And then you also have the Naley stuff with the marriage counseling in this episode, which is nice to... It's once again, with the counseling stuff, it's kind of like them talking about their relationship and their past, talking to us as the audience, but having the counselor there as us, which is nice in it. And this is kind of just like, we knew that they were going to be okay at the end of the last episode, but this is helping get through that in a realistic way. Pretty good episode. Then leads us into the next one, which is 514, What Do You Go Home To?, which originally aired April 21st, 2008, was directed by Liz Friedlander and written by Mark Schwann. This episode is mainly about Lucas returning, coming back to the basketball team, which he is supposed to be head coach of, and has only actually coached one game, their first game, and they've played 9 now. He's a terrible high school coach, honestly. Like, he comes in, coaches that one game, then he's gone for 8. Comes back and coaches. There could have been a couple games in there that we don't see, but the next one we see is in episode 17, and then he ends up getting suspended. I think overall he coaches maybe 3 games the entire season while he's a coach there, which, I mean, we'll talk about that later, and how they kind of just... I guess he ends up not being the coach after this season, which, I mean, obviously they're going to go find he ends up, grabbing a kid, so they're not bringing him back for another year at Tree Hill High. But he returns, and they're trying to repair the team. Q's injured, obviously. He makes Q go to the doctor, and he has to put the cast back on. Quentin's really mad at Skills because Skills went and told Lucas about it, and he was trying to keep it a secret because he wanted to get a scholarship, and now that he has this on his hand, he thinks he's not actually going to be able to play, which they end up working things out. While they're there at the hospital, they run into Dan, and there's a really good shot scene of Dan in front of Lucas and Nathan. Jamie's in there too, them on an elevator and going down, and he's like, if you boys want to jump me, now's your chance. But then Nathan follows Dan out and tells Dan to leave his family alone. He's been seeing him coming around and watching Jamie, I guess, or whatever. Not watching Jamie, that sounds weird. But trying to talk to Jamie. Jamie loves Dan. And then Lucas and Jamie have a conversation as well, like, why is everyone mad at Dan? And Lucas tries to explain it in terms of Chester, which obviously Jamie doesn't know anything about Keith, and that'll come up at a different point. And we know that Dan was there getting a checkup, but really it was the stuff to do with his HCM, which probably were to do the test and whatnot, which he ends up finding out that he needs a heart transplant, which I guess that probably, I'm assuming that he probably actually found those results out later in that episode, and that's why he was at the high school, and he's thinking about the past and looking at the his jersey being taken down, and just rethinking through all of it, coming to the end of his life here. Haley decides she wants to get back into music. Obviously, she hasn't done anything with music since her junior year of high school. I guess she had one song her senior year that was on that Friends for Benefits album, Halo. But other than that, she hasn't done music in a long time, and she's wanted to get back into it. So she goes and talks to Peyton, and that's the next album they're going to put out. Which honestly, like, I'm trying to think about that. I'm trying to think whether or not she actually, does she put out an album in season 6? Maybe she does at the end. I can't remember. I know that she does in 7, but I'm trying to think about season 6 and in terms of her music career in that season. And Nathan and Haley are also searching for a new nanny in this episode, which at the end, the reveal is Haley found one, and it's Deb. Deb returns to the show, which is nice. The first time we've seen her since the high school years. And she comes back and she stays in the show, obviously, for a little bit as a bigger character, which is I'm glad they brought her back. And Brooke finds out in this episode, obviously, too, that she is getting a baby. She ends up getting the baby at the end, but she's preparing for it throughout the episode, buying all these different toys, buying all these different things for what she thinks the baby might need. Owen freaks out about it, apparently, but we don't ever see it. We just hear about it. This is why I think that Joe had something, like some other obligation. That's why this ended up happening, because I can't imagine, like, having the access to have him come back to the show and then writing it in this kind of poor way. But Chase ends up coming. This is the second time he comes back. He comes, this is his final episode in the season. He comes back and he ends up pretty much breaking up with Brooke for Owen. And then he said he's taking off too. So I guess they're like just getting rid of their apartment. I don't know where Owen technically goes, but he's out of there too. But they kind of tease like a Chase and Brooke relationship moving forward in this episode with that, because he kind of mentioned that, if you need anything, like a husband, just obviously he still has feelings for Brooke at this point. So it's interesting too when we get to the next season, when we know who he gets with in season 6. It's interesting, the Brooke thing. So we do that, and the episode ends with her getting Angie in the airport, and that's the end of 514. Also in this episode, we have the stuff with Millicent too, finding out that she's a virgin, Mal turning down the Omaha job to try to stay in Tree Hill and make something at this news station, and then Millicent moving in with him. But that was 514. What do you go home to? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, guys, and I will see you guys next time.